John Sutter is a National Geographic Explorer. He's a documentary filmmaker. He is an analyst, and he appears on CNN a lot. Very, very influential, incredibly talented. John, welcome. When you're done, my colleague, Dr. Imani Cheers, will join you on stage and engage you in conversation and bring some students and others in for some questions and conversation with you. So I'm going to step aside, turn the stage to you, and it's all yours. Have fun.
Thank you, Frank. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So as Frank mentioned, I'm a documentary filmmaker and a journalist who's focused on the climate crisis. And lately I've been working on this project called Baseline, which, like I said, aims to sort of stretch our collective memory and get us to think about time in a new way with relation to the climate crisis. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that and about that sort of future leaning. Okay. Before I do that, though, just because I'm a storyteller by trade, I have to start with a story. So this is Lauren McClenahan, who is an environmental historian at Colby College, which is kind of like an interesting and a little bit unusual title. And basically what she does is she looks back in time for visual evidence of the ways in which things are changing, right? Like the climate crisis occurs on Earth time across decades and generations and centuries even. And she's looking at environmental change in that way. And she told me this story about some photographs that she found in a library in Key West, Florida. So this is one of those photos. It's from the 60s. This is the thing that people love to do when they go to Florida. Maybe some of you are in Florida, is to take a picture with their trophy catch and sort of show off the fish that they've caught for the day. You can see, again, she found this from the 60s. As we advance forward through time, because she found photos through the decades from this exact same dock, you can see that the fish start to shrink. And by the time we get to the 2000s, the fish are almost unrecognizable. They were as tall as the people in the photos, and now they're the size of, I don't know, like a forearm. Like they're very tiny. And so what happened here? Because if you look at you look at this image, like the fishermen are still smiling in these photos. They're still happy about the catch. They haven't really noticed this change that has been occurring slowly. And basically, because of overfishing, the size of the fish have shrunk because too many of them have been pulled out of the ocean, and the species are changing, right? Like some of them are depleted to the point that they're not being caught anymore. And Lauren McClenahan and other fisheries scientists, Daniel Pauly was the guy who coined this term, call this phenomenon shifting baseline syndrome. And I know this is a little like wonky and academic, but it's basically this idea that environment takes place on a different timescale than our storytelling abilities typically and our alarm systems, right? So it's a gradual build, a slow turning up of the heat, as opposed to like an event, a moment in time that we can recognize as alarming and then respond to. So in some ways it sort of sneaks past some of our alarm sensors. And as someone who's spent years and years covering the climate crisis as a journalist, this is really scary to me. Like I've spent a lot of my career up very close to the climate crisis and talking with people who are very much feeling the effects now. This is a photo from Honduras a couple years ago, where a very intense drought linked to climate change was pushing people north. This is from the Marshall Islands, a country in the Pacific that, as I'm sure many of you know, is so low-lying that it could be displaced entirely by sea level rise, putting an entire culture, a language, a history, all at risk. And then this is from Puerto Rico. I was there for quite a while as an investigative journalist for CNN, reporting on the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. I met a man who was living in this house for months after that storm without a roof. And so it's scary to me to think that we would normalize these stories, or we wouldn't be able to fully grasp the magnitude of these changes that are unfolding in front of us, that we might be like those fishermen in the photos. Of course, like we know the data, like we have for quite a long time. This is Dave Keeling from Scripps in San Diego, who was among the first scientists to start like charting and measuring the buildup of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which of course is, you know, a result of our burning of fossil fuels, which acts like a blanket around the planet and is causing things to heat up. That, you know, this is in the 1950s when he made this important finding. But, and so, you know, we have this like sort of intellectual sense that we know what's changing. We can plot it on a graph. We can like map it. But what I'm worried about is that we don't feel it in our guts in the same way we do other emergencies. And it doesn't translate always into our storytelling. And I know that in part because of this researcher, Fran Moore, who's at UC Davis. And she was very interested in this concept of shifting baselines and how people process like a really pretty simple question, which is like, is today unusually hot? It's hard to know, right? Like we're sort of bouncing on this trend line all the time, and it's hard to know if what you're experiencing day to day is unusual or not, because it's, again, this change that gradually builds up over time. And she went to like what I think is a really fascinating place to try to answer this question. She thought, you know, okay, where do people complain a lot about the weather? And that place for her was Twitter. And so she analyzed tens of thousands of tweets about heat and came to the conclusion that our memories are only about 2 to 8 years long when we decide whether we think a given day is unusually hot or not. And that memory shifts forward with us through time, right? Which is that normalization process, where if you're only remembering the last 2 years, you know, 100 years from now, what you think is normal is going to be very different from what we would think today, much less 100 years ago. And this is, again, another kind of wonky chart, but it just shows like the perception in blue of you know, how we feel about change in temperature versus the reality in red. And, you know, when you think about like our storytelling abilities, I think that they're failing us in some ways. This is a newspaper front page from 1988 when James Hansen testified that the era of global warming had begun. If you really look closely at the conversation, in some ways it feels like it's been going in circles, and there are similarities that cross decades. So I know that all of that is a little, to me, it's very troubling, but I don't want to stop there, of course. I want to talk about, you know, ways that we can stretch our thinking and try to get our heads around this massive crisis that we can fix. And in my own like sort of quest to think about that, I decided to spend some time with scientists who already have a handle on this, right? They call it, you know, longitudinal research, the idea of watching something over time. And I spent some time with this guy, John O'Keefe, who's at the Harvard Forest in Massachusetts. And, you know, decades and decades ago, just almost on a whim, he decided that he really liked walking through the forest there. And that while he was doing that, that he was going to take like super detailed notes about every tree and when it was, you know, budding in the spring, when it leafed out. Like he just knows these trees in this forest in a way that no one else does, and has decades of records. And what happened while he was doing that was that the climate crisis emerged. He started before it was really as known as a piece of science. And you know, his note taking, his walks in the forest, became the most detailed record of the ways in which that place has been changing because of the climate crisis. And again, this is called longitudinal research, right? Like following a happening at intervals, looking very up close over a long period of time. And so that brings me to the project that I'm working on now, which is kind of stealing that idea of a longitudinal study and applying it to film or to storytelling. And the premise of this project, which is called Baseline, and I'm working on Baseline Part 1 right now, is to follow children in 4 locations in 5 installments between now and the year 2050. Again, the aim is to sort of stretch our collective memory and get us to try to think about the climate crisis in a new way. I also see this film as like a provocation in some ways, right? Like we are part of these stories, and we are shaping the way that they will turn out. So the 4 locations, like each of them is chosen based on a different climate impact. One is Shishmaref, Alaska, where the permafrost is thawing and the sea ice is melting. It's a village that has sort of toyed with the idea of a relocation plan or an expansion plan because the ground has become unstable. Dominica, which is in the Caribbean, which was devastated by Hurricane Maria and is, faced with the threat of growing storms. Majuro in the Marshall Islands, which, as I said before, is seas there are rising and causing these increasingly troubling floods. And then a town in Utah where everyone relies on a river that has been increasingly running dry. So again, these are stories where people are very much like connected to a sense of place, and I think are kind of they're the John O'Keefe's in a way, the guy in the forest, right? They're watching up close and they have a sense of what's changing. And my hope is that they are sort of protagonists in helping the rest of us see the truth about what's happening. This is Monty and his dad in Utah. They're ranchers, and again, therefore very dependent on the water supply there, which has been increasingly unreliable. And one cool thing we're doing is it's sort of enlisting the kids who live in these communities to help us document what's going on. So this is from a video that Monty took on horseback, like helping his family round up cattle. And again, I see them as important witnesses to help us put a story to that data trend line that we've known for so long, and as an important provocation, because I mean, the truth is we know that carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere in the ocean systems for like about 1,000 years, right? So knowing that can be terrifying and it can be paralyzing, but I see it as motivating and as an opportunity, because in a way we live in that future already because our actions do. Our actions today are shaping that world and our own world right now. And so our positive decisions, if we're able to kick this and get off of fossil fuels and become, a carbon neutral society, then those decisions and those actions matter for that long across this like multi-generational, huge like Earth time scale that it's really hard for us to think about and to get our heads around. But I think with some concentration and focus, it's something that we definitely have the capabilities to tackle. So thank you for listening about this project. And I think now we're going to do some questions.
Hello.
Hi there.
Can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
Hi. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, John. That was phenomenal. I have so many questions, and we have a little bit of time. So I just want to encourage everyone, please use the Q&A tab to put your questions in there, and I'm going to be filtering through. I have a couple questions to get us started. But John, one of the things that really sort of stepped out to me and stood out to me during your presentation was this idea of, stretching collective memory. I was taking like vicious notes and your longitudinal research. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about how did you pick the locations? And I see Maddie in the general chat has the same question. How did you pick the locations? As a filmmaker and storyteller myself, I deal with a lot of in sub-Saharan Africa and the Caribbean. So I noticed that I'd just love to have you share a little bit more about how those 4 locations came about.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it took a lot of work. Some of it was based on where I had existing relationships, because I mean, this is in some ways like a partnership with these communities. And so places where I already had a lot of ties, like Shishmaref in Alaska, for example, I've been up there a few times, first for CNN in maybe 2009. And so I have kind of longer standing relationships there, the same with the Marshall Islands. But I was super lucky and got this fellowship where I had some time to think about that question. And it was at a university where I could speak with a lot of experts, right? And try to weigh things. And it's kind of devised around this idea of like, what are some of the main impacts of the climate crisis? So we have, like Arctic story is one of them, sea level rise is one, storms. and then drought in the case of the story in the Western U.S.
Mm-hmm.
So it's trying to represent that. It's trying to represent geographic diversity, racial
Mm-hmm.
diversity. And they're
Mm-hmm.
also, an important thing for me was they're all places that are better than those of us in urban environments, I would say, at being connected to place,
Mm-hmm.
where like place is inherent in identity, and where like people are very attuned to the micro changes that are unfolding. I mean, in Alaska, for example, like there's this amazing tradition of passing names across generational lines, and so it's almost kind of like a metaphorical reincarnation where people who are gone are still with the village, and so that place has an amazing like sort of cultural and environmental memory, and I think that that's something that the rest of us can learn from. So that's a lot of it too.
That's phenomenal, John. And questions are coming in. Please do that. And in a moment, I'm actually going to bring up two students who have and get some live questions and get them engaged. And even speaking of students, I love that this baseline project focuses on young people. As a mother myself, I have a 7-year-old son, and I do wonder how is climate and climate change going to impact his lifespan. I look at and I think, you know, my grandmother is 94 years old, and then my son is 7, and I look at all the things that she's seen in her life and all the things he's seen in his short life. So I'd love for you to just share a little bit about why even choose children to sort of follow and tell this story to, and what do you hope is going to be the larger impact looking at this from, I'm assuming 2020 or so, like it's a 30-year span?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, no, the focus on children it's a couple things. One is that, you know, young people have the most at stake in this crisis because they're going to live the furthest into it. So that was kind of where that premise came from. I also think it will be interesting to follow up with the same people, you know, through time and see how both the place is changing and how they're changing, and how they're thinking about these issues evolves or shifts over time. And I also just think it's like, if my idea here is to kind of like reshake our thinking a little bit and try to get us to think in different timescales and to think about the ways in which we're impacting our own futures and the futures of real people all around the world all the time. I think that kids bring like a freshness to everything that is nice and can help break through like sort of old thinking on some of this stuff. Like it's amazing just to even see the videos that they're creating from like their eye level, you know, like the world looks and feels different from that perspective. So that's part of it too.
I love that, and it's so true, as you mentioned, in terms of having the most stake in the game, of course, and people who are going to be impacted. I love the idea of looking at 30 years, and then also giving them the power to tell their stories, right? Giving them the tools for them to document all the things that you and your crew, you know, might miss. Right? What are sort of the day-to-day experiences? So adding all of that is just absolutely phenomenal. I love it. We have some pretty good questions coming in on the chat. And I am going to read out one of those. Jansen Bayer said, we got some votes on that. And following on that, what are some of the unique perspectives you have found in interviewing children versus adults? Are children more optimistic about their future than adults may be about theirs? You know, like it's the beauty of naivete almost.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm like hesitant to do like total generalization. I think that there's an older couple in that village in Alaska who I know pretty well, and if you've lived, you know, 80 some years, then you've seen up there like very stark changes in terms of like when the sea ice is forming. A lot of the land has disappeared, like their neighbor's house fell into the water because the land caved. And so they have, I think, a perspective just in terms of like their life experience that is different from a young person. But I mean, I find young people remarkably thoughtful and considered, and I do think that they're aware of what's going on around them and often like deeply troubled by it and therefore motivated. like I said, I don't want to be a pessimist here, because I'm really not. But I think that we do have to grapple with like the hugeness of what's going on, and I think these kids are doing that.
Fantastic. Quick question before we bring up one of our students, speaking of young people, but for those who really want to know, and this is got posted, should I say bumped up in the chat, how often are you going to be checking in? When can we see the first installment of this project?
Yeah, we've been shooting the first installment just recently, and so I mean it'll be a year or so before it's out into the world. The pandemic has frankly slowed that down just a bit, but you know, if you go to baselinefilm.com, there's a newsletter you can sign up for there, and I post updates, and so you can, you know, keep tabs on that. I'm also JD Sutter on Instagram and Twitter, so you can kind of follow the progress of the project in those places.
Fantastic. I'm glad you saw that peg there I shot for you. So fantastic, John. Thank you so much. We have Brianna Quintana. She has a question. Brianna, please turn your mic and camera on. Brianna Quintana is a newly minted graduate of Northwestern University, where she studied journalism, global health, and Spanish. She is coming to us from her hometown of Palm Springs, California. She recently interned with the documentary film producers Retro Report, and she will intern with NASA this summer. So Brianna, welcome. What's your question?
Hello. So my question, hi. So you said that you will use firsthand video footage from the children you feature in the series. How do you think using firsthand video will contribute to discussion and action on the climate crisis?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think it's meant to center the perspectives of young people and for us to be able to see the world through their eyes. And I'm hoping that creates a sense of empathy with communities that are really struggling with dramatic effects from climate change, like now. And yeah, like I said, I think that in some ways the film is trying to provoke audiences to realize those connections, and therefore, you know, make changes because of it. Like the end of this film, like in 2050, it's not like the climate crisis stops in 2050, but it's at least trying to trigger a sense of thinking about the future that maybe we don't have when we see other stories, which is that, you know, you're going to be engaged with these communities for a long period of time, and our actions are going to shape the ways that their stories unfold.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks for that fantastic question. I think our time is actually up, if I'm not mistaken. But John, thank you so much. And oh no, I am allowed to go to the last student. Yes, I'm checking my behind the scenes text message in there. Okay, fantastic. So we have one more question and one more student to bring up. So Kara Reagan has a question. Kara, can you please turn your mic and camera on? Welcome. Kara Reagan is a junior journalism and mass communications major in the School of Media and Public Affairs here at George Washington University. She's joining us from Bedminster, New Jersey. She's a student in one of my colleague, Lisa Palmer's science reporting class at SMPA. So Kara, I'd love for you to share, what's your question for John?
Hi, thank you. My question is, how do you think your approach to science storytelling through discussing the issue with children will inspire action at this point in time that other efforts to inspire action haven't done so thus far?
I think that the main thing that makes this project different is the way that it's dealing with time, right? Like that it's provoking a longer term thinking, like a stretching of collective memory. And I think hopefully by putting a finger on this idea of shifting baseline syndrome, which I do think is one of the major reasons that we're not doing more faster about the climate crisis, that will be a wake up call for people. So that's my hope, is that by seeing ourselves in the context of Earth time, right? It both, you know, like I said, at first, when you think about that, it can almost be paralyzing, but it's an incredible opportunity and responsibility that we have, not only to kids who are growing up right now, but also to people who, you know, aren't born yet and won't be born for generations to come. And to me, that is like a very motivating push when you really understand the full magnitude of what's happening on the planet right now.
Thank you. That's a great actually answer to in this portion of our summit today. So Kara, thank you so much for your question. John, thank you for all of your insight.